Welcome back to our class on Basar B'chalav. We are continuing in Siman, Sadi, Aleph, and we are in Seif Dalid. We are investigating the rule known as Tata Gavar, that the bottom one influences on top. We spent a significant amount of time talking about the way in which we define which one is the bottom and where the force of the heat comes from, whether it's from the heat alone or it's the pressure or the fact it's in the place and the heat is acting against it and moving the heat through the item. And in trying to understand them, Mitzias, the Prima Gunam asks an interesting question over here. Why is there a dispute of the top one is stronger or the bottom one is stronger? So we saw originally in the Gemara that the Rav and Shmuel, there's a machlekes epis. So here, if you want to look at it inside, it's on the Taz on Sif Zion. He asks an obvious question, the Prima Gunam. Why can't we just have somebody test this theory of which one moves more flavor, top or bottom? And so there's a really easy way to do that, at least I'll pay the Gemara, which is to have an expert non-Jew come and check it. So this isn't something that is untestable. There's not a theory that you couldn't look at the different parts of it and discover which one transfers better. So why is there this machlokas? Just, go look and see what actually happens. So the Prima Gunam is asking this question based on what we'll learn about later on, which is what's called Di'imus Kfela. It's a non-Jew who is an expert at these flavors, and that expert is able to determine if the flavor has gone further. So the question is, why couldn't you just test out the different cases? Have one where it was sitting on top of the cheese, and have one where it was sitting on the bottom of the cheese, and make the top one hot and the bottom one hot. See if the meat tastes like the cheese or not from an expert non-Jewish cook. Okay? So maybe that's the only time that they were having a dispute. Maybe if you actually had a kfela there, he opens, that it would actually override whatever we observe. So the Prima Gunam says that if you were able to test it, which we'll see later on that we according to the Ramah that you can't, according to the Chaber that you can, has the non-Jew taste it, that might be able to change the outcome. So this was a case of where you can only go with the burger which you were handed in front of you, and you don't have a kfela, you don't have a non-Jew to come and taste it. The Rabbi Yehuda addresses this issue in one of his tshuvas. He addresses it in a tshuva, and it's in Madur Kama. So Rabbi Yehuda has 2 volumes. This is in volume 1, and this is tshuva number 28, and in Yoreh Deah, in the section of Yoreh Deah. And he says that there is no set, hard and fast rule that you have to always have the bottom one moving the flavor in and of itself. Okay? So you may have to actually use some other considerations, like where's the fire? Where's the heat coming from? So those situations might change the actual outcome based on how we would move around the heat, because the energy would change when the heat is, let's say, on the side or coming from above down to below. So the fact that this one's on the bottom is going to be different. So you have to look at the whole picture in order to determine how you're going to resolve this issue. The Aruch Shulchan here, he asks this long question, and he says, well, L'maisa, we don't rely on the expert non-Jew. And he says here, so if you look at the Sefim Chester Yud in his book, so he says that you're only going to rely on the received tradition from Chazal, and for sure that if it's the bottom one that we say that transfers flavor, so then it's going to move that flavor into the other thing. Okay? So, but some things you don't have to worry about this. So, for example, if the bottom one is a kli rishon, it's the utensil that was cooking on top of the fire, and it falls into it, that you don't need that. You don't need the rule of Tata Gavar to resolve that, right? We know that transfers flavor, and we know that transfers flavor until 59 parts of 60, okay? Or that the full fledge of the flavor transfer goes up until 60 times the volume. And then we say that maybe a non-Jew could come along and tell us that it's not that flavor, and then really we measured wrong, so, and say that really it should be less than shishim. Or he's telling us he knows this is it, and then therefore we have to be strict, even when we thought we had shishim. Okay? However, Rav and Shmuel, this is not such a firm determination, okay, by having one on the bottom, one on top. We don't have this as a received tradition that this is the way it has to be. Rav and Shmuel are looking at a majority of cases. Okay, our majority of cases, does the top influence the bottom, or does the bottom influence the top? Okay, so therefore we hold like Shmuel, and we say the bottom influences the top, and therefore if hot falls into cold, it's permitted, just like the Brisa says. And we don't have to worry about a non-Jew tasting it to see if it really did transfer flavor or not. Okay? And so, therefore, even if we were to taste it, we would just say maybe he's, if we see for sure that it fell on something cold, for sure it's going to be permitted. Okay? And when the bottom is hot, for sure the top one is prohibited. Okay? Now, if it fell on the bottom one that was hot, so you had cheese that fell on the bottom one was hot. Now, let's say we were relying on him, and he came along and he tasted the top piece and said there's no flavor of meat in this cheese, then he would actually permit it. Okay, that would be because this rule of having a non-Jew taste it and report back applies to all types of yisurim. So that's the case. Okay, so the Aruch Shulchan seems to imply you can't be strict neged Tata Gavar. That's his one. That's his one dispute with the Pri Megadim. Now the Placey seems has a different, in the Class Yoreh Deah, he says that maybe a little bit goes in. Okay, so that's what we seem to say. So, and the Chazon Ish says also by Kavush Kamavushal that a little bit goes in, and so that's why we have to say that we have to consider it something to be prohibited. So the Kfela may not notice it or not. It's just that a little bit goes in. The Chazon Ish says this in Chazon Ish in Yoreh Deah Lama Gimel, Sif Cut and Zion. He says that by Kavush Kamavushal a little bit goes in. So you could make the same argument over here as well. And so that's what we would have to say, is that even though the non-Jew doesn't or doesn't taste it, we still prohibit it because we know for a fact that flavors transfer. It's not predicated on the flavor actually transferring. We still prohibit it. So that's an interesting opinion. And that would make sense in terms of us saying that maybe the kefila doesn't work. Okay? So we basically just take the opinion that it's not going to work. Now, we mentioned also the size influence this. If we have a very large cold thing and a very small hot thing, this Tata Gavar going to be influenced by that. So let's say you have something that the top thing is really big and the bottom thing is not. Or do they have to be like the same size for this rule to apply? Meaning that the top thing shouldn't be larger than the bottom hot thing. So this is another question that the Aruch Shulchan brings up immediately after this. So after he gets done with that, he says, so obviously that has to make some sense to it. The flavor has to transfer. So Tata Gavar, does that mean that the flavor will transfer? It also means that it's going to be cooled off by the hot one. Okay? So if you have a lot of milk that's boiling hot and you pour it on a little bit of meat, okay, so it's going to cool off all that hot milk, and if you nonetheless see the hot milk is still going to be quite warm afterwards, so why is that going to influence the temperature of the meat as well? And we haven't really talked about kiluach yet. We haven't talked about pouring. We'll get to that in the next lecture. But basically what he's asking is a very simple question having nothing to do with if this is like cooking or not. He's just asking why would, in this case, when you're pouring tons and tons of milk on top of this cold piece of meat, why wouldn't the heat of the top, while it's still going on top of it, influence it more? If there's a really hot piece of meat too, and you pour a bunch of cold milk on it, so then why wouldn't you say that as long as the milk is pouring on top of it? Like, say you'd have a cold meatball in a big pot. Sorry, you have a hot meatball in an empty pot, cold pot, and you pour cold milk over it. You should say that as long as you still keep pouring milk over it, that it should prohibit all the milk. But I don't understand. It's all cold, right? We see that the milk stays cold when you pour a whole bunch over it. So in Sif Yud Beis, he gives the following answer: that they do have to be rather similar in size. Okay, and there's a similar machlokes in Tosfos talking about kiluach on Shabbos Mem Beis Amud Aleph, and it's called Notel Adam. Okay, so that if you have that's Dibur Maskal Notel Adam. So if you want to look up that Tosfos. So what he's saying over there is that in that case we're talking about being with Mitzaref a Kli. If you have a hot utensil and you pour a lot of cold water into it, the Gemara seems to say that's not a problem, and that is because it's going to cool it off, so it's not going to be a problem of cooking on Shabbos. And that's even if the heat was heated up all on top of the fire. So you have a very low empty pot and you pour a bunch of cold water into it. So if you add enough water to it, Tosfos opens over there, that you've cooled it off, and so therefore it's not a problem of bishul, okay? And the cold water's in there, even though it's surrounded on all sides. The fire is not retaining enough heat energy to change the temperature of the water at all, especially not to get above the sort of the minimum 108 or so of Yad Soledispo that many people, 108 degrees Fahrenheit, that many people say is Yad Soledispo. And so we say that's permitted. That's what that Tosfos says. Because in that case, we see with our own eyes that the cold is enough to cool off the hot thing, even though it's on the bottom. Okay? And so it's going to be permitted, all that water, because by Shabbos we don't say that there's bishul kol shehu. We say that we look at the whole thing, and unless the whole thing rises in temperature, it doesn't count. Okay? And the Aruch Shulchan says that this even applies by two solid things. If the temperature somehow evens out, maybe. I think he's trying to say it theoretically. Okay, so what we see from the Talmud and from the Poskim is that Tata Gavar seems to apply in every single case, and even if they're a little bit different. But if it seems like it's a bit absurd, use your best judgment, because that's what the Noda B'Yehuda was basically implying, is that you have to use your best judgment to see what the case is actually like. So if you have a meatball that gets messed with by a giant cheese wheel, right? A giant Gesundta cheese wheel. You can't tell me that when you cheese wheel falls on the little meatball that it's going to go all the way through the whole thing. So the question is if it's going to go further or not. Okay, and so that should be the main thing, is to look at it that way. Okay, especially if there's not shisha. Now again, if there was 60 times against it, obviously that would be a problem. Okay, so you should be strict in both ways. Even to take the argument of the Aruch Shulchan that if you pour cold water on it and it changes the temperature of it, then and vice versa, then you should adjust the svara that same way. But that's just sort of theoretical. It wouldn't actually happen that way. So So therefore, you have to use a little bit of judgment in this case, and that's really part of it. Is that there's not really some good answers to this. Some people have written that is it cooking it or is it just absorbing it? So we saw different people arguing that it's just an absorption, like Chazon Ish talks about by Mavashel, by Kavushka Mavashel, that it's not really full visual. It travels a little bit of flavor through it, but it's not nearly as efficient as actual cooking. So that would be the idea: is that it's if it's cooking it or not. So the Aruch Shulchan seem to take that approach that is kind of like cooking, and other people seem to take the approach that it's just kind of moving the flavor through it. And so therefore we need to use a little bit of judgment in the case. So you should be strict in a case of where it's for sure when the bottom one was heated by a Kli Rishon, and it was on the fire, that stuff that comes on top of it should become completely prohibited. However, if it's something that we saw that sometimes it comes from the side, or there's not pressure on it directly, or if it's always a liquid, that maybe there's room to be lenient. So if you pour a bunch of milk on top of a hot meatball, and you can assume that maybe the shishim will cool it off. So use your judgment in each one of these cases. It's not such a simple thing. So Tata Gavar mainly should be looked at as something that is done where the items are of relatively similar size, and maybe you could say that it would prohibit something up to the exact size of the thing that is coming out on top of it. So I think we'll hold it here for our class today, and we will come back and talk more about pouring from Kli Rishon and those type of things, how they impact Tata Gavar. There's a lot in here to unpack, and we'll go slow so you don't get overwhelmed. So, but there's a lot to talk about. A lot to talk about. So we'll continue to talk about Tata Gavar in our class next time. Thank you very much for joining, and we will see you next time.